Welcome back to Behind the Policies, Understanding Duality in Modern Governance. I'm your host, and today we're diving into the digital dimension of policy duality. In the age of algorithms and endless scrolling, technology has fundamentally transformed how policies are created, promoted, and perceived. But here's the question that keeps me up at night. Is technology democratizing policy influence, or is it simply giving those already in power newer, shinier, and more effective tools? In our previous episodes, we explored what policy duality is and the mechanisms elites use to shape policies to their advantage. Today, we'll examine how technology both amplifies these mechanisms and potentially offers new pathways for greater transparency and participation. So put down that smartphone, well, unless you're listening on it, and join me as we unpack technology's double-edged role in policy persuasion. Let's start with what's probably become the primary battleground for policy persuasion: social media. These platforms have emerged as the predominant channels for disseminating policy information, but they operate through two very different pathways of influence. The first is what researchers call the central route to persuasion, where users engage deeply with information, carefully evaluating policy benefits and drawbacks. This is the ideal we often imagine: citizens thoughtfully considering proposals based on evidence and reasoning. The second pathway, however, is the peripheral route to persuasion, where behavior change occurs without careful consideration, influenced instead by cues, repetition, emotional appeals, or the perceived credibility of the message source. And guess which route dominates on platforms designed for quick scrolling, emotional reactions, and algorithmic amplification? The research here is revealing. A 2022 study found that reliance on social networking sites for learning about environmental health risks positively associated with general risk perception, which in turn promoted policy support. In other words, the more people relied on social media for information about environmental risks, the more likely they were to perceive those risks as serious and support policies addressing them. This might sound positive, but it reveals how easily perception and policy support can be shaped through these platforms, not necessarily through factual information, but through emotional appeals, selective emphasis, and strategic framing. The same mechanics that make you more likely to buy a product after seeing it in your feed are now being applied to shape your views on tax policy, regulation, and government programs. What makes social media particularly powerful as a policy persuasion tool is its capacity for micro-targeting. Traditional mass media broadcasts the same message to everyone, but social platforms enable tailored messages to specific demographics, regions, or even personality types. This allows policy advocates, whether government agencies, think tanks, or interest groups, to frame identical policies in completely different ways for different audiences. For conservatives, a policy might be framed around tradition and security; for progressives, around fairness and care; for parents, around family impacts; for business owners, around economic effects. Each group sees a version of the policy crafted specifically to appeal to their values and concerns, potentially masking aspects that might provoke opposition. It's like political shapeshifting, and it makes genuine public consensus almost impossible when we're not even seeing the same information. Next, let's examine how think tanks, those policy influence powerhouses we discussed in our last episode, have evolved in the digital age. Traditionally, think tanks mainly influenced policy through direct engagement with lawmakers, publishing academic-style reports, and getting coverage in elite media. Their audience was primarily other policy professionals, not the general public. But digital platforms have fundamentally changed this dynamic. Today's think tanks increasingly use social media to extend their influence directly to voters, bypassing traditional gatekeepers like journalists and academic reviewers. They're producing shorter, more digestible content optimized for sharing, videos, graphics, memes, and brief explainers that can spread quickly online. This shift represents a massive expansion of their potential influence, from the confined world of policy insiders to the broader political landscape. Comparative analysis of think tanks' digital strategies reveals some fascinating patterns. Organizations like the Heritage Foundation have built massive follower bases across platforms, often using what we might call the peripheral route to persuasion, emotional appeals, identity-based messaging, and simplified framings of complex issues. Meanwhile, more traditional research organizations like Brookings or RAND tend to emphasize the central root, focusing on evidence-based arguments and nuanced analysis, but often reaching smaller audiences as a result. The digital landscape has created what amounts to an attention economy in the policy space, where the most shareable content, not necessarily the most accurate or nuanced, tends to dominate. And in this ecosystem, well-funded think tanks with sophisticated digital operations can amplify their preferred narratives far more effectively than academic researchers or grassroots organizations with limited resources. What's particularly notable is how digital platforms enable these organizations to rapidly respond to emerging issues and shape the initial framing before alternative perspectives can gain traction. When a policy crisis or opportunity emerges, whether it's a financial crash, public health emergency, or international incident, well-resourced think tanks can immediately deploy pre-prepared frameworks and solutions, essentially setting the boundaries of acceptable debate before most people have even started thinking about the issue. Social media's speed advantage means their interpretations can go viral and become the default understanding of an event or policy proposal within hours. By the time alternative analyses emerge, the narrative may already be locked in. It's like showing up to a debate where your opponent has already convinced half the audience. You're fighting an uphill battle from the start, regardless of the merits of your position. Nowhere is the technology policy nexus more relevant today than in the governance of artificial intelligence itself. As AI technologies advance at breakneck speed, questions about their regulation have moved from academic discussions to urgent policy debates. And here we see a fascinating case study in real-time elite influence over emerging policy domains. Several well-funded think tanks focusing specifically on artificial intelligence policy have recently established themselves in Washington, D.C., most linked to billionaire-backed movements or large technology companies. These organizations are actively working to influence how lawmakers understand and ultimately regulate AI, pushing particular visions of what responsible AI means and what governance approaches are appropriate. Visions that, not surprisingly, often align with their funders' interests. Research on stakeholder motivations in AI governance reveals a complex landscape where economic interests, ethical concerns, and power dynamics intersect. Large technology companies have successfully positioned themselves as both the creators of potentially risky technologies and the essential experts needed to govern them, a remarkable feat of narrative control. This positioning gives them outsized influence over emerging regulatory frameworks, often allowing them to shape governance approaches that maintain their competitive advantages while appearing to address public concerns. Meanwhile, civil society organizations and academic researchers frequently find themselves playing catch-up, with fewer resources to develop competing frameworks or challenge industry-preferred narratives. The result is governance that may appear comprehensive and principled on the surface, while preserving significant freedom for industry to develop and deploy AI technologies with limited oversight. What makes this domain particularly significant is how it creates cascading effects across other policy areas. As AI systems increasingly inform or automate decisions in healthcare, criminal justice, financial services, employment, and beyond, the governance frameworks established now will shape outcomes in these domains for decades to come. If these frameworks primarily reflect elite perspectives and interests, the resulting systems may perpetuate or even amplify existing social inequalities, all while being presented as objective, efficient improvements over human decision-making. We're potentially witnessing the embedding of policy duality into the very infrastructure of governance itself, where algorithms trained on historical data and designed under industry-friendly frameworks make decisions that appear neutral but systematically favor certain groups. It's policy duality operating at machine speed, with even less transparency than traditional governance processes. Another critical dimension of technology's role in policy duality involves surveillance capabilities and their dual purposes. Smartphones have become the primary devices for surveillance activities, enabling highly personal and geographically locatable tracking. These tracking capabilities originated primarily in consumer contexts, companies wanting to improve services and target advertising. But the resulting data and processing methods have rapidly expanded into policing, security, and administrative domains. This creates a particularly powerful form of policy duality, where the same systems that provide convenience, personalization, and security also enable unprecedented monitoring of citizens' movements, communications, and behaviors. The policy justifications emphasize the benefits and protections, while the privacy implications and potential for abuse remain understated or obscured. What's striking about digital surveillance is how it operates through multiple, overlapping systems simultaneously. There's commercial surveillance by technology companies and data brokers, tracking our online and offline behaviors to build detailed profiles. There's state surveillance for security and law enforcement purposes, with capabilities greatly expanded after events like 9/11. And increasingly, there's a fusion of these systems, where commercial data becomes available to government agencies through purchases, partnerships, or legal requirements. Each system has its own policy frameworks and justifications, but together they create a comprehensive surveillance infrastructure that few citizens fully understand or consented to. And unlike traditional policy domains where impacts might be noticeable, digital surveillance is designed to be invisible. You don't see or feel it happening, which makes democratic oversight particularly challenging. What's striking about digital surveillance is how it operates through multiple, overlapping systems simultaneously. There's commercial surveillance by technology companies and data brokers, tracking our online and offline behaviors to build detailed profiles. There's state surveillance for security and law enforcement purposes, with capabilities greatly expanded after events like 9/11. And increasingly, there's a fusion of these systems, where commercial data becomes available to government agencies through purchases, partnerships, or legal requirements. Each system has its own policy frameworks and justifications, but together they create a comprehensive surveillance infrastructure that few citizens fully understand or consented to. And unlike traditional policy domains where impacts might be noticeable, digital surveillance is designed to be invisible. You don't see or feel it happening, which makes democratic oversight particularly challenging. So far, our exploration might seem rather dystopian, technology primarily serving as a tool for elite influence and control. But digital technologies also create potential pathways for greater citizen participation in policy processes, potentially counterbalancing elite dominance. Digital platforms can facilitate public consultation, enabling citizens to provide input on proposed policies without geographic limitations or the need to attend physical meetings. They can make government data and decision-making more transparent through open data initiatives and digital access to documents. And they can enable new forms of collective action, allowing citizens to organize around policy issues and amplify their voices. In theory, these capabilities could democratize policy influence, creating more inclusive governance processes that reflect broader societal interests rather than just elite preferences. However, the reality of digital participation often falls short of this democratic potential. Research on digital consultation processes reveals significant disparities in who participates, with higher income, more educated, and tech-savvy citizens vastly overrepresented. Many platforms intended for public engagement struggle with low participation rates, limited diversity, and minimal impact on final decisions. Even when participation is substantial, there's often little evidence that public input meaningfully influences outcomes, particularly when it conflicts with powerful interests. As one researcher put it, digital consultation, too, often serves as a form of symbolic inclusion that legitimizes decisions already made through traditional channels of influence. It's like being invited to a party where all the important conversations happened before you arrived. Your presence is noted, but the key decisions were made without you. That said, there are promising examples of digital platforms successfully expanding meaningful participation when designed with equity and impact in mind. Participatory budgeting initiatives in cities like Paris and Madrid have used digital platforms to engage thousands of citizens in allocating portions of municipal budgets, with demonstrable impacts on spending priorities. Taiwan's vTaiwan platform has facilitated substantive public deliberation on complex regulatory issues, including ride-sharing policies and alcohol sales, using sophisticated technologies to identify areas of consensus across diverse stakeholders. What distinguishes these successful examples isn't just the technology itself, but how it's embedded within broader governance processes, with clear connections to decision-making authority, resources for inclusive participation, and design features that promote deliberation rather than just aggregating preferences. The technology itself is necessary, but insufficient. Its democratic potential depends entirely on the power structures and institutional designs it operates within. Another fascinating dimension of technology's role in policy persuasion involves the emergence of what we might call the influence economy, where attention, engagement, and persuasion have become quantifiable and marketable commodities. Social media platforms don't just enable communication. They're specifically engineered to capture attention and shape behavior, with sophisticated algorithms optimizing for engagement. This creates a marketplace where those who can generate attention have significant power, including over policy narratives. We see this in the rise of social media influencers engaging in policy discourse, not just traditional celebrities or politicians, but content creators who have built large followings and now shape their audience's understanding of complex issues. Research shows that factors such as perceived authenticity and similarity to followers positively affect parasocial relationships with influencers, which in turn influences followers' perceptions and intentions on matters from consumer choices to policy positions. What makes this influence economy particularly significant for policy duality is how it creates new pathways for elite interests to shape public discourse. Traditional policy influence required working through established institutions, political parties, news media, academia. Today, influence can be purchased more directly by sponsoring content creators, funding targeted advertising campaigns, or building dedicated audience channels. This has led to what researchers call attention capture by well-resourced interests who can afford sophisticated digital marketing strategies. During policy debates over issues like net neutrality, healthcare reform, or financial regulation, we've seen coordinated digital influence campaigns designed to mimic grassroots sentiment, what's sometimes called astroturfing, where industry groups create the appearance of public support through sponsored content and paid amplification. The line between authentic public opinion and manufactured consent becomes increasingly blurred in this environment. The metrics-driven nature of digital platforms further complicates matters by creating perverse incentives around information quality. Content that generates strong emotional reactions, particularly anger, outrage, or fear, typically drives higher engagement than nuanced, balanced analysis. This creates what some researchers call an outrage incentive in policy communication, where the most successful content often presents simplified, polarized versions of complex issues. We've seen this play out across numerous policy domains, from immigration to public health, where nuanced policy discussions are overwhelmed by emotionally charged content optimized for engagement rather than understanding. It's like trying to have a thoughtful conversation in a room where the person who shouts the loudest gets paid more. The economic incentives work directly against the kind of deliberation democratic governance requires. Beyond shaping how policies are discussed and formed, technology is increasingly determining how policies are actually implemented through algorithmic decision systems. From welfare eligibility and tax auditing to criminal sentencing and child welfare interventions, algorithms are increasingly making or informing consequential policy decisions. These systems promise greater efficiency, consistency, and objective application of rules, addressing legitimate concerns about human bias or capacity limitations in traditional implementation. Yet research consistently shows that algorithmic systems often reproduce or even amplify existing social inequalities, despite their apparent neutrality. This creates a new form of policy duality, where systems presented as improving fairness and efficiency may actually be hardening disparities into seemingly objective technical processes. Several factors contribute to this algorithmic policy duality. First, most algorithms are trained on historical data that reflects past discriminatory patterns. If certain groups have historically been subject to greater scrutiny or negative outcomes, algorithms learn these patterns as valid predictive signals. Second, the metrics used to evaluate algorithmic performance often prioritize overall accuracy rather than equity across groups or avoidance of particularly harmful error types. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the technical complexity of these systems makes them difficult for non-specialists to meaningfully scrutinize or challenge. When a human official makes a questionable decision, the reasoning can be questioned and the official held accountable. When an algorithm produces a similar outcome, its mathematical operations often function as a black box, resistant to traditional accountability mechanisms. What makes algorithmic policy implementation particularly relevant to our discussion of elite influence is how technical expertise becomes a new vector for shaping policy outcomes. The design choices embedded in these systems, what data to use, what outcomes to optimize for, what constraints to apply, fundamentally determine their impacts, yet these choices are typically made by technical teams with minimal public input or oversight. Those with the resources to hire top technical talent or commission custom systems gain significant advantages in shaping how policies actually function on the ground. We've seen this in areas like financial services, where sophisticated algorithmic systems for credit scoring or high-frequency trading create structural advantages for larger institutions that can afford cutting-edge technologies. It's a digital version of the resource appropriation mechanism we discussed previously. Technical capability, rather than direct financial capital, becomes the means through which public systems provide disproportionate benefits to those already advantaged. Our final exploration concerns perhaps the most fundamental way technology shapes policy, through the production and analysis of data that serves as evidence for policy decisions. The digital revolution has created unprecedented capabilities to collect, process, and analyze information about virtually every aspect of society, from economic indicators and public health metrics to environmental conditions and social behaviors. This data abundance creates potential for more evidence-informed policymaking, with decisions based on comprehensive understanding rather than limited samples or anecdotes. Yet access to high-quality data and advanced analytical capabilities is highly unequal, creating what researchers call data divides, that influence whose experiences are counted in policy evidence and whose remain invisible. These data divides operate through multiple mechanisms. At the most basic level, digital technologies produce more data about individuals and communities with greater digital access and usage, creating systematic gaps in information about less connected populations. Beyond collection issues, there are significant disparities in data processing capabilities, with government agencies, large corporations, and well-funded research institutions possessing far greater analytical resources than community organizations, smaller nonprofits, or advocacy groups. This asymmetry means that policy evidence is disproportionately shaped by those with greater data capabilities, often missing critical perspectives or issues primarily affecting marginalized communities. Even when relevant data exists, proprietary restrictions often limit access, with valuable information trapped behind corporate ownership or prohibitive licensing costs, unavailable for public interest research or advocacy. The policy implications of these data inequalities are profound. Consider healthcare policy, where comprehensive data from private insurance claims informs understanding of treatment efficacy and cost-effectiveness, while the experiences of uninsured or underinsured populations remain relatively undocumented. Or urban development, where sophisticated location data from smartphones and payment systems captures patterns of those with higher technological usage, potentially missing the needs and behaviors of lower-income residents. Or labor policy, where gig economy platforms possess detailed data about worker activities and earnings that isn't available to those designing protections for these workers. In each case, the resulting policies reflect the experiences and needs most visible in available data, creating a subtle but powerful form of policy duality where those already advantaged by technological access become better served by supposedly evidence-based policies. It's a digital version of the age-old problem. If you're not counted, you don't count. As we conclude our exploration of technology's role in policy persuasion, three key insights emerge. First, digital technologies are fundamentally reshaping all aspects of the policy process, from how issues are framed and discussed, to how citizen input is gathered, to how decisions are implemented and evaluated. These technologies aren't simply neutral tools, but architecture that structures political possibility, creating new pathways for influence while potentially closing others. Understanding policy duality in the digital age requires looking beyond formal governance structures to examine the technological systems that increasingly mediate political communication and decision-making. What appears on the surface to be modernization or efficiency improvements often represents significant shifts in who has voice and power in policy processes. Second, while digital technologies create new mechanisms for elite influence, they also offer potential pathways for greater transparency, participation, and accountability. The democratic promise remains, even if unevenly realized. The same tools that enable sophisticated targeting and persuasion can facilitate collective action and information sharing among traditionally marginalized groups. The same data capabilities that create advantages for well-resourced organizations can, when deliberately designed for equity, reveal hidden disparities and unmet needs. The key factor isn't the technology itself, but the governance structures, power relations, and design choices that shape how it's developed and deployed. This suggests that policy responses should focus not on limiting technology, but on creating institutional frameworks that harness its democratic potential while mitigating its tendency to amplify existing advantages. Finally, technological literacy, understanding not just how to use digital tools, but how they function in policy contexts, has become essential for meaningful civic participation. In a world where algorithms shape what information we see, where data determines what issues receive attention, and where technical design choices embed value judgments about who and what matters, citizens need new kinds of knowledge to effectively engage with governance systems. This isn't just about digital skills in the narrow sense, but about understanding the political dimensions of technology, recognizing how platform design influences discourse, how algorithmic systems allocate resources and opportunities, and how data collection choices determine whose experiences inform policy. Without this deeper literacy, the technological systems mediating our collective decision-making remain black boxes, their inner workings and implicit values hidden from democratic scrutiny and deliberation. Thank you for joining me for this third episode of Behind the Policies, Understanding Duality in Modern Governance. In our next episode, we'll move from mechanisms to real-world examples, examining specific case studies of policy duality across different domains. We'll look at how COVID-19 response policies balanced public health with industry interests, how technology industry incentives created regional winners and losers, and how decentralization in governance can both empower and disadvantage different communities. These concrete examples will help us see the abstract concepts we've been discussing in their practical applications, where the rubber of policy duality meets the road of everyday life. Until then, I encourage you to observe the digital policy landscape with fresh eyes. Next time you scroll through a policy debate on social media, notice who's shaping the narrative. When you hear about a new algorithm being deployed in public services, ask who designed it and for what objectives. And when you're presented with policy evidence, consider whose experiences might be missing from the data. The digital dimension of policy duality is all around us. Once you know what to look for, you'll never see governance quite the same way again.